Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Faith and Science in Catholic Schools. This is a production of the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, also known as ITEST, in partnership with WCAT Radio. My name is Patrick Panozzo. I am a board member of ITEST, and I have with me here today Franklin Parmar, a high school teacher of biology. Is that correct?
Amongst other things.
Amongst other things. Okay, so we have a science teacher of high school, and you're in California.
I am.
Could you share some more about the school you teach at and the area you teach?
Sure. I work at a school here in Southern California in Anaheim, Cornelia Connelly School. It's a college preparatory independent, so not diocesan, all girls Catholic high school. So 9 through 12.
9 through 12, all girls. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It was founded by the Sisters of the Society of the Holy Child Jesus in 1961, I want to say.
Okay.
And it's for myself, it's my 5th year there. It's my 8th year teaching overall after college. I like it so far.
Okay. And so you had 3 prior years at another school? Was it another?
Yeah,
Catholic
I do.
School?
I had 3 prior years at another Catholic school, also all girls, actually.
Also all girls. Okay.
Just by coincidence.
Yeah, that's similar to me. I've taught in only 2 places, and they were both all-girl Catholic schools, and both independent as well. So, yeah. So, and you said you've been teaching. You're in the science department. How about you explain a little more about which courses you've been involved in and which year level of high school?
Right. So it's partly because we're such a small school, have to wear many hats. I mean, I think the easiest way to say it would be I teach life sciences. In more detail, I teach all the levels of biology. So I have all the 9th graders in either college preparatory or honors biology. And then I have a bunch of upper division, I guess you can say, courses, 11 and 12th graders in AP biology or anatomy and physiology or oceanography or AP environmental science. I also coach academic decathlon, as if I wasn't doing enough.
That's many hats in the Catholic school system. So how many students are there?
The whole school itself at the moment is around 130 girls.
Okay.
In the 4 grade levels. I think, we have a bigger maximum capacity, but it's a problem all schools are facing these days. All the private schools.
That is true, and that mostly, well, there's probably several factors for that, but one of them is certainly cost. It's private education, like public education, just keeps going up and up.
Yeah, it is.
So how did you come to teach the sciences, and certainly at the high school level for that matter? What's your background academically?
Right. Well, I have a bachelor's degree in biology. So I thought I would either go into teaching or go into the field, and I don't know. I always liked tutoring when I was in high school. I ended up doing it privately or in public schools too, and figured I might as well run with that. So I ended up, I have my teaching credential here in California, but I still chose to work in a private school. I like it better, get to be more overtly Catholic. And then while I was actually, so I have my bachelor's in biology, and then while I was teaching, I also got my first master's in environmental science, and I'm working on this other one right now. I should be hopefully finished in a few months with the second master's in theology. So really like the interplay between the two. Oh, also, it helps that I'm also joining the Dominican laity, so throw that into the mix. I think it's a good combination. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, okay, so I'm fascinated by that, your decision to go and pursue a theological degree. So it's a master's from to enhance your teaching of biology, or this was just sort of a side project, or how do you see those two things working together?
It's a side thing mostly. I mean, I did it just because I like theology. I'm doing it for fun. That being said, I think it has already helped enhance my teaching of all my life science classes, really. And I'm spending more and more time talking not only about the science, but how we approach the science, the philosophy of the science behind it, and also just about, since we're at a Catholic school, I can more easily, I can better talk about any of these issues between faith and science that might come up or that the students might have. So I think it does help, and it's a good melding of the two.
Do you find those issues come up from the student side of things, or do you find that in your presentation and teaching of them that you're more likely to bring them up?
It comes up sometimes from the student side of things, but honestly, it's probably more for me. And I think part of that just has to do with the students don't even know what to ask, or they're so, for example, they're so like ingrained in culture or what the media tells them. They're not even aware that there's another viewpoint, or that the viewpoint they might have isn't perhaps even quite the appropriate one, or not appropriate, but that's a strong word. Quite the Catholic viewpoint, as it were. I mean, just one thing that pops into my mind is, for example, when I first talk about evolution, and kind of how Catholics approach evolution, and I see a lot of them actually have more of a sort of fundamentalist Christian viewpoint, that it has to be creationism and evolution's not allowed at all, and how dare we talk about it. I'm like, well, that sort of idea was never really a Catholic idea.
Right, and that comes as a surprise to them.
Yeah, they're like, oh, I didn't know, or they think, oh, I didn't know we could do that. I tell them, yeah, as early as 1950, the Pope said something about how we could be open to the idea of evolution. They're really surprised about it sometimes.
No, that's right. In fact, it's in our theology textbook that I teach out of, makes reference to, I think it's Humanae Generis, maybe, is the encyclical letter of Pope Pius XII. That's right.
Yeah.
So that's curious to me that in Southern California you get the more fundamentalist, even Catholic fundamentalist interpretation of creation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's a majority of them. It's just one of the ones that kind of struck me when I first heard it. I'm thinking, that is odd. And I think, keep in mind, these are the freshmen I'm talking about, the ninth graders, so they haven't really done the high school religion curriculum either.
Right.
Not much yet.
Fair enough, yeah. Okay, so I've heard you use the word now about overt or more explicitly Catholic presentation. So you were probably already, well, I won't put words in your mouth. Did you think you were already comfortable, addressing issues within the life sciences or biology or anatomy and physiology from a more Catholic perspective, or do you find yourself holding the line more with like state standards or perhaps the secular view? Not those two things are necessarily in conflict, but as your objective or your focal point, did you feel, obviously you've got more comfort to bring the Catholic side into your classroom, but was it ever thought to be more intentional even prior to your study of theology?
That's an interesting question. I mean, if I think about it, I was never specifically trying to teach anything that was against our faith, as it were. But, just as the years pass and you learn more, I have changed a few things, partly because earlier on, my first few years of teaching, I'm following the textbook because I'm new at this and I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
I'm trying to focus on the management and just teaching them. And so I'm following the textbook and, because I'm not an expert in everything anyway, not to the level of detail like that, or even if I am, I learned it, the last time I might have seen some of that stuff was when I took the class in high school. And so I think really since then I have more made the material my own, kind of covered it or put the appropriate Catholic spin on it when I could. I think I've gotten better at kind of making that connection.
Do you have? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Do you have colleagues then in your department that are similar or might do things differently, or what kind of freedom do you have within your role at that school?
Because we're so small, that's kind of why I have so many classes. I'm the only life science teacher. My department chair teaches chemistry, and then we have my department chair, she teaches chemistry and a few math classes. We have another teacher who does all the physics and a few math classes there.
Right.
So not so much colleagues in the same, no colleagues in the same exact courses.
Right. But as far as the approach to science from the school-wide level, would you say the administration or even those people who teach theology, are they part of the conversation in how science is presented?
That's a good question. No, they're not. Like, for example, to specifically answer for the ones who teach religion, no, they're not part of the conversation, but that's not because we don't want them to be or there's some kind of split there. It's just We're all so busy with our own thing. It's not. and the idea is, we are in sync with one another, that if something comes up in one of their classes, we're willing to. It's good to have that interdisciplinary thing, and I think we're all of the same mind about that.
Sure. Yeah.
That we want to.
Yeah, I'm in
everyone.
the same boat. Yeah. I mean, I didn't make it clear at the beginning, so just to clue in any listeners here that I also teach at high school. I guess I mentioned I teach at all-girls school, and but I'm on the theology side of things, and we rarely find ourselves in conversation with anyone in the science areas.
Right.
But yet we are talking about some of the same things, and so I guess it's more about school culture and what is the norm and what's acceptable. And if you hear something's going on in that class, well, then you want to address it in your class, and there isn't conflict or adversity to be faced there, but there is a sort of a delicate way of treating these topics sometimes. Evolution being one of them. It's not perfectly straightforward, and there's lots of confusion, and science is going to teach it a different way than theology is, or at least approach it in a different way. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so have you heard, since evolution's come up a couple times, in terms of the teaching of Genesis, do you find yourself ever mentioning Genesis in your presentation of biology, or do you know what your theology people in your school are saying about Genesis and the creation account?
I don't know what the theology people are saying. For my side of things, I like to do PowerPoints, presentations, things like that. And I usually just go off of what the book does. I try not to add in too much of my own on the presentation. That being said, when I am presenting it, I always go off topic, onto tangents. And so I add it in verbally every year. And I do talk about it. And I'm sure the theology side might cover it too at some point, I would hope. But, in terms of that specific example, it's more like I tell them, look, that there is no conflict. We're not necessarily biblical. We're not taking it literally in that part of Scripture.
Right.
Or that, when we talk about evolution, we're talking purely about the biological side, the science side, the physical side. I'm not saying anything about the soul. And then from that, I think it's more of a general conversation. I do spend a significant amount of time, at least a class period or so, talking with them about this idea of, is science it's more of that idea of what we say scientism today. They have this idea that science is everything, and if it's not a part of science, it's not real somehow. And that's something I do try to dissuade them of, this idea that if it's not science, it's not truth, or we don't know it as well.
Mm-hmm. You find that is common, though? You think scientism, yeah.
I think it is common, but again, not out of any sort of antagonism. The overarching thing I have noticed is just ignorance. They just don't know. They've never heard it another way. Mm-hmm. What they've heard from the side of science, really, that's kind of what they get from hold on, I lost my train of thought. So what they get from science, a lot of that tends to be kind of pop culture or from social media or headline newspapers.
Right. Sure.
That's not the actual full science. Front page headlines, that doesn't really give them the level of detail that they need to see what the science is actually saying. At the same time, on the side of faith, hopefully these kids are at least going to Mass once a week, but sometimes not even that. And so how can you expect them to have a strong faith tradition or a strong basis knowledge in their faith if they're hearing, maybe a 20-minute homily once a week?
Yeah.
One of the things I make a point to tell all of them every time, they have to learn more, which is great because, I work at a school. But they need to delve deeper. They need to always figure out what's actually being taught. Not pop science, not theology light, but what the actual issues are. And at that point, that's when they'll come to see, there isn't a discrepancy, there isn't a dichotomy. The answer is always more nuanced than they think.
Yeah, I think you reminded me of something that isn't necessarily just a faith science or, faith and reason problem, but the pop science phrase you used, or the headlines or the media or how these things do get communicated, it might be just really a secular view or one that is not terribly interested in the details, more interested in just the headline. Which is to say, I think science gets reported frequently, studies or some new discovery. You very rarely get the full picture from. Well, I mean, maybe that's a trait of our culture today. The speed at which things pass and the time people actually put into something, what they're willing to engage. Yeah.
Right.
So you have that problem, whether it's, go ahead.
Yeah, well, like just as an example of that, you look at a newspaper headline, scientists have cured XYZ type of cancer. And then you get into the actual paper and it's like, yes, it was cured in 60% of rats, 30% of the time in this one preliminary trial. I'm like, that's not quite the same. But that doesn't make for good headlines.
Right.
That doesn't sell.
Which it kind of begs the question, with scientism, in other words, we trust, we believe, we think, well, the only real reliable truth or information we can depend on is that which is garnered through, the scientific method or the physical sciences. And yet we can't even really know for sure or trust that the information that's being communicated to us is even real or true. And yet we trust it without questioning it too much, I think, as a culture.
Exactly.
In a general sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. The other thing with that, too, it's how because the science becomes the pinnacle of everything, this comes up actually significantly in my environmental science class, because I love environmental science. And, we have this issue, I think, to use a somewhat controversial example, but it's this issue of climate change, global warming, climate change. And a lot of Catholics actually seem to be against it or resistant to this idea. And really, I think it's because it's not so much the idea itself, it's the possible consequences of it. Because, at least in the secular world, what's one of the big ways that they advocate to fix that problem? They talk about birth and population controls, that there's too many people. And I say, well, you know what? That's not a science issue. The science can just tell us what's going on. In terms of a solution, anything, the science can tell us what we can do, or the science and the technology can tell us what we can do, but in terms of what we should do, that cannot come internally from the science itself.
Right.
And, for example, with this issue, I always tell my students, look, because I think I've looked at it myself a bit, and I don't see it as an issue of population, for example. I see it as an issue of our resources are not evenly distributed, and we waste a lot. Yeah. And so the easy way out, I tell my students, the easy way out is population control. The better way out, the proper way out is, kind of having charity, caring for people and the environment. But that takes more work, more effort, requires the rich people, first world countries, to sacrifice their 2-mile-a-gallon Hummers or whatnot.
Yeah. Well, in both instances, it seems you've jumped to the moral question. You're right. I mean, you could say there's a scientific question about resolving or dealing with a problem of, the physical world. But in either instance, whether it's, some sort of population control or it's some reduction of our, the throwaway culture, as Pope Francis would put it.
Right.
In either case, we're making some moral judgment about what's right and good and best and meaningful and true.
Exactly.
Which isn't necessarily what the science doesn't suggest, which is the proper moral path, right?
Exactly. And I think part of, along with the scientism, and that's all that matters, this goes along into that a lot of my students think, oh, whatever the scientists tell us, that must be true, but then so must the proposed solutions, the practical application of it, which that's not. I mentioned the environmental example because a lot of the stuff we study environmental science, it does tend to come a bit past the theoretical, past the book learning, as it were, and we apply a lot of it to our cities and our society and how we live and how we build treatment plants and everything like that. It's much more practical in that field, these real-world problems. And it's not pure science. We're going beyond science. When we're talking about people and societies and ethics and morality, or even aesthetics, all of that. And so it requires us to approach things. If you have that mentality of just scientism, that's not necessarily going to give you the best answer, the best path to take.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's used as a weapon too. That is science, or the science supports this. The science backs this up, and that's suggested that the culture trusts. You can't argue with science, and yet there are plenty of arguments to be made within the research. This is this is why you have to present a paper and do your due diligence and have it tested by your peers. And true science is always constantly being tested, right?
and modified. There's always, we might not overthrow a theory completely, but you can always modify it, change it as we learn more and more. It's not like we know everything.
Which is curious then, since we're on the controversial topic, let's pursue it a little more. When you hear the phrase, the science is settled, do you think that's more of a religious statement? or is that, when is the science, or how would you interpret, the vast majority of scientists agree that this is a settled issue? I suppose some things in science are eventually settled, but but even
then, I agree. Yeah, some things are probably eventually settled. Again, I teach the life sciences, so it's even a bit fuzzier than physics or chemistry, for example. Life always throws a wrench into things. But in terms of, how it's settled, for example, I would say we have plenty of evidence for evolution. That is settled in a way. It's one of the first things we learn in Chapter 1 in freshman biology, what's the difference between a theory and a hypothesis? And then this idea of, when people say they have a theory out in the world, that's not quite the same thing as a scientific theory. A scientific theory that's as sure as you can pretty much be. That being said, there can always be another experiment, another test that someone does that could change things. I wouldn't say it might overturn everything, because you have 100, 1,000 pieces of evidence to make up a theory, different experiments and things, but you can always tweak it. You can always modify it. I mean, the same thing with evolution, for example. We talk about, I guess, what Darwin came up with, evolution by natural selection, but then we also see that there are actually other types of evolution that aren't necessarily natural selection. You have things like, the other ones are even more random chance. They look like genetic drift and being struck by lightning. That's not quite evolution, but it does change the face of your population.
Okay. Yeah. Chance. Or, Well,
or at least
an act of
from
God.
the point of science. That's what I was going to say. From the point of science, that's as best as science can get. Is there anything supernatural going on?
Yeah.
As a scientist, any scientist making a judgment on that, they're stepping beyond the bounds of their field.
Yeah.
If they're going to say anything about the supernatural, there's no scientific support for that, because by definition, science studies the natural. Yeah.
Which confirms that there's limitations, right? The area, no matter what science it might be, has boundaries or limits.
Exactly. The other two I really bring up all the time when I talk about those limits, which I think it's easier for the students to start with this. It would be math and art. I tell them, what scientifically, why is this artwork beautiful? Oh, art's beyond science. And so is math. But math is beyond science, and they never think about that. Honestly, when I first heard it, I thought, oh, that's true. It just stumped me for a second. We use our math to prove our science, not the other way around.
Okay.
I asked them, tell me, what's the number 3? I'm like, 3 what? I'm like, no, just 3. You can't prove 3 with science, but rather you can use the math to help prove your science. Math comes before science. There are things that come before or outside of our science, modern science. Math being one of them, and that's the one they can never argue with, or they think, oh, that is so very true. Yeah, and then from there, it's a good jumping off. Yeah, from there, it's a good jumping off point, I guess, to the metaphysics.
Yeah. So, how far back can you take science then, in terms of like origins? If Darwin's writing about the origin of a species, do you ever take it to its extreme, and especially in a Catholic context? So, from the Catholic worldview, if you're teaching science, you're trying to stay strictly, academic about it within the realm of that topic. But at some point, you have to explain why anything exists.
Right.
Or how it came to be, or what design, arose as a result. For example, I'll just throw one out there, like complementarity of the sexes, which, again, could be a sticky or controversial topic in today's present, school system, or even in the state of California. I don't know how the law is pursuing this today.
It's interesting. I mean, you bring that up. It's really interesting because I was thinking something along that line. I don't cover it. I think it's a bit too in-depth, perhaps, for my students.
Okay.
That being said, I think part of this issue, too, even in our Catholic schools, or rather, it's been something that's been going on for, well, not only my students, but many of their parents, too. We've had very poor catechism the last few decades.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And so the kids don't even know how to think or how to reason or how to do philosophy. And on the science side, they don't even know I think we should offer at least a little crash course before teaching any science class, something about the philosophy of science, this whole idea that science isn't everything. What is the proper role and boundaries of science? And on the religion side, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think the religion teachers I've worked with are amazing, but they're bound by diocesan requirements of curriculum and things like that. And honestly, a lot of it just kind of ends up being the warm and fuzzies, the Jesus loves me and that's all I need to know about faith sort of mentality.
Yeah.
I think there was a study actually done recently. Was it a Pew Research one? I don't quite remember who did it. But they found that the average person who lost their faith, they lost it when they were about 13 years old, so in the 8th grade. Or they have an 8th grade level of education and faith. And I'm thinking, okay, I mean, I'm pretty sure I was pretty dumb when I was in college. How bad was I when I was 13? How much did I actually know when I was 13?
Right.
Looking back, I would not trust myself to make that kind of decision in junior high school.
Probably
and
not.
And that's the level of education they have when they're making these decisions.
Yeah. But the point is well made, and I believe it because I've seen similar studies on this too, and I think there's something to it. It's sure multiple factors and multiple levels here, but I think some of it, maybe even a lot of it, has to do with a failure to meet them intellectually and to truly challenge them with the seriousness of the questions and the the personal impact it has on our lives and on our world.
Right.
From a theological side, I mean, the human mind is complex, and we need more than just the literal, the symbolic and the figurative, and all of these truths that are spoken about in Scripture and in our tradition. When they are not taught at the appropriate academic level and maturity of, say, a 13-year-old, then Jesus loves me eventually just doesn't. It's not enough.
Exactly. We have this one. I won't say what school it was at or when it happened. And again, I think the religion teachers I know right now, they're amazing people. But I did have this one thing that happened once. One of my older students, she came into one of my classes. I think she was an 11th grader at the time. And, I had some time. She asked the question, so I thought, why not? Let's talk about it. She was just saying, my grandma is Baptist, and she says, why do we pray to the saints? And this girl couldn't give a response to that. And I'm thinking, okay, I have the time. Why not answer it? Let's talk about that. It's not related to class at all, but if I'm able to, why not? About 45 minutes later, 45 minutes passed, so I'm just talking about all the theology of it. I'm kind of doing apologetics, not just the wishy-washy stuff on the surface, but I'm kind of going deep into the reasoning and all that. Why? And 45 minutes later, she's like, wow, I just learned more in the last 45 minutes than I have in 3 years of my religion classes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, thank you, and how sad.
Well, I have two reactions to that. The first is how powerful that can be from a science teacher, right? Again, as a culture, as a community, through Catholic education, the mission of our schools should be one where that kind of message can happen in any corner of our institution.
Exactly.
And I think when the science teacher can touch somebody at that level on a topic like that, it's even more powerful. The second thing is it just sounds like there's some really intelligent, interested people, and you gotta once you've got their interest, you meet them again at their intellectual level.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to want to know more. They're hungry for it.
I think we're too afraid of being, what if they don't understand this or something, but we can't underestimate them. And one of the biggest overarching thing I've always seen every time this question between science and faith, or just faith itself, has come up, the majority of them are not antagonistic. They're not that set in their knowledge. They don't think they know it all. Most of them are just ignorant. They don't know what there is in terms of Catholic teaching or in terms of the science. They just don't know. And so they're hungry to learn. But if the teachers on either side, I think it's important that science teachers have a little grounding in philosophy, and if you work at a Catholic school, in theology and how we approach these things, and religion teachers need that ability to talk about what is science and what is scientism, that sort of thing.
Yeah, to be conversant.
Exactly. And if the teachers are not conversant, then, there's not going to be any change. Nothing's going to get better.
Well, that's an excellent point. I think it's a great suggestion too. The philosophy of science would be highly beneficial from that side of things. But you're right. I think some sort of ability for our theology teachers and teaching of religion to have some grasp on what the current discussion and issues are around science, and why these two things are not in conflict and are truly complementary, right? God gave us both faculties, the faith and the reason to come to know His truth.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me transition then for a second and ask you then about your theological study. Since your background is science, you teach science, but you've grown and gotten more comfortable in the theological realm. You said you were kind of inspired to get the theology degree out of just interest, but what have you learned? What's been your favorite thing about it, or what's your biggest takeaway from your theological study of late?
Oh, I don't know. It's kind of like Socrates. The more I learn, the less I think I know.
Yeah.
I mean that's why this actually applies to what I said earlier. It's one of the biggest things I always tell my students. You have to go and study more. You always have to go and look into it. Don't stop at the surface. And as I go deeper and deeper into theology, I think, oh my gosh, I can't cover this idea of evolution even in one session, or the Big Bang and all of that. You can't cover it in a short amount of time.
Right.
And you can't cover it by just reading one article or a tweet or one Facebook post or anything like that. There's so much detail, so much nuance to it. It's so well thought out. I tell the students, look, whatever you've thought of while standing in the shower for 20 minutes, the amazing revelation you've had, I guarantee you 2,000 years of Catholic, or more than 2,000 years of philosophy and theology and teaching and thought, people have thought about this before. Yeah. Your revelation isn't really a revelation. Go and see the mountain you're standing on.
Yeah, no, excellent.
And I think, and that's partly coming from myself. I'm like, and thinking, it requires a measure of humility, which I think on both sides, or at least more so perhaps on the science side, that's something we're lacking. We need to have that humility to to kind of see, here's what other people have come up with, as a scientist, we're thinking so much, if I'm doing any research, I don't go and do all the prior prerequisite research myself. That's what other people have done, and I'm taking their word for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm building
Absolutely.
on top of other people's work. And yet, when it comes to matters of theology and faith, why do I think I need to start always at step one? I'm willing to trust other scientists and what they've empirically done, but I'm not willing to trust the thinkers and philosophers and the thousands of years that have come before me.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think that's something I've really kind of clarified as I've gone deeper into my own faith and study of theology.
That's an excellent point. I think I know the humility thing is such a huge thing at the start of my teaching of anything as well. I teach Scripture and I teach sacraments. I've taught church history and ecclesiology as well, and that I always put that out front right away about my assent to the church's teaching is grounded in, or has to be acknowledged that, look, there's 2,000 years of the Catholic tradition, and like you said, centuries more of people of great faith doing God's will, and they have thought about these things and reflected on them and lived them and prayed about them. And who am I to come in and question or kind of think somehow I can reinvent these things? There's a whole lot of trust that must go into the great saints of our tradition and the doctors of the church and everything else. It this made me think of, since you said the science maybe is the side right now that could use a little more humility. It's the late Stephen Hawking, which of course he was a physicist, not in biology, but who I'm talking about. He liked to dabble in these religious questions. I think there's a posthumous book of his out last year maybe, and it was sort of like questions about God or something. Not with the big question. I think it was called The Big Questions, perhaps. And the first question of the book, chapter 1, was, is there a God? So he was always kind of out there talking about his atheism and how science disproves the existence of God and things like that, which I thought was an amazing lack of humility. That he thought incredibly smart guy, right? And tried to. What's the film? It was The Theory of Everything, right? He tried to come up with an explanation for everything. So, I'm not sure.
I don't know. We're so scientists. We tend to be so critical of our own fields. Of is that really true? Is that really what the science is teaching? And yet, when it comes to matters of theology or philosophy, we're all experts somehow.
Yeah, pretty quick.
We take it right off the bat, and I've spent 5 minutes studying this. I'm an expert. When in our own fields, we're like, I've spent a lifetime on this, and I'm still going to look at it critically and see, is this really what's going on? So there is that kind of separation there. But scientists need to work on it.
No, it's fascinating stuff. I appreciate your time in discussing this. I'm glad you're out there doing the hard work and
Thank you.
Engaging our students. And I wish you the best, and God bless you in your work.
Thank you.
Anything else you got on your mind? Anything we missed or you thought of that you might like to share as your final words of wisdom?
Oh, I'm sure there's a lot, but, how much of it's just me repeating myself? No, I think it really just comes down to, and I think this goes back to my Dominican third order, Dominican laity thing, you have to always be studying and learning both your faith and science in this case. Yeah. They're both important, and they can enrich each other. It's as Pope John Paul II said, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. It's the same truth, whichever way you approach it.
Yep. And I don't know how many times I've quoted, I don't know if it was Albert the Great or Thomas Aquinas, one of the great Dominicans. Never deny, seldom affirm, always distinguish, which I think is a good adage for both science and theology.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Exactly.
Well, Franklin, it's been nice talking to you. This has been Faith and Science in Catholic Schools. I am Patrick Panozzo. You've been listening to an interview with Franklin Parmar on WCAT Radio. Thank you for tuning in, and have a good day.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.